Welcome to the DDP podcast channel. We sincerely hope you will enjoy this episode. Don't forget to turn on your notification bell and to follow us right here on Spotify for more podcast episodes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us today. Thank you for coming into this episode of DDP Podcasts. Today, I'm joined by Diana, who is the country coordinator for APRM in South Africa. I will link, as usual, the full bio of our guest speaker. And I am so excited to enter this conversation with her. We're speaking all things women and representation in parliamentary settings. And I think this conversation in placement with Youth Month is so crucial because amongst the youth, the most disenfranchised is actually young women. And so having these conversations in terms of their empowerment and their future just in general in South Africa and their feeling of representation is so crucial and so important. But before we get into that, Diana, just the formalities. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Yanga. I'm doing very well. I mean, it was a long weekend, so I think time to rest, spend time with family. So yeah, I'm glad to be here today. And once again, I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Amazing. So just to start with just some groundwork for our audience, can you just tell us about your work at APRM?
All right, yes. So the African peer review mechanism, which is shortened into the APRM, is an autonomous entity of the African Union. It was created in 2003, and the founding countries, there were five founding countries. South Africa was one of them at the time of President Thabo Mbeki. And it is an institution to which EU member states voluntarily conduct reviews. So reviews, if you can call them like self-monitoring sort of exercise. On the theme of governance. So basically, the APRM is an autonomous entity to which EU member states voluntarily self-monitor their governance performance using a very specific and unique methodology, which I will break down. But in terms of the performance and the progress of those countries that are measured, we use 5 thematic areas, which is democracy and political governance, economic governance, the other one, actually the economic governance and management, the other one is corporate governance, socioeconomic development, and the 5th one, which was recently added, I mean, not really recently, as it's as old as the COVID-19 pandemic, which was in 2020. So in 2020, the APRM added a 5th thematic area, which is state resilience, just to assess, how countries are actually performing in terms of having the right mechanism, legal framework, the right legal frameworks, but also institutional frameworks in place in order to see if the country is resilient enough, or if there's any gaps or progress that needs to be made in terms of resilience. So in short, the APRM raison d'etre is to promote good governance. As I had briefly mentioned the methodology, what we do at APRM is that we have put together a very unique methodology, which was actually innovated by Africans for Africans. It's a methodology that has been adapted into the African context, because very often and in the past, we've seen that the systems that we have in place in Africa, the processes that we've put in place in Africa are very much replicated from the West, So this methodology which we apply at the APRM is a very thorough process that is summarized in six steps. It consists of the nomination of national structures. National structures are national secretariats. So I work for the Continental Secretariat of APRM. And at national level, in all countries, we have secretariats which work hand in hand with the focal point. The focal point is a minister or a high-level government official that basically is the link between the APRM and the head of government or the head of state. So basically, this minister is like a special advisor to a head of state or head of government of a country that will advise him and on the APRM related issues. And when you say APRM, you speak of governance, obviously. So this process, as I say, starts with the national structures, which are founded by the country. As I have to remind here, the APRM is a voluntary country, so country will accede to the APRM voluntarily. And once they accede to the APRM, it means that they commit to undertaking or seeing through the APRM process. So yeah, first step, nomination of national structures. Second step is the country self-assessment report, where the country will now decide, okay, let's gather all the stakeholders, let's bring everyone around the table, and then let's just assess how we are doing on those 5 thematic areas I mentioned earlier. We do that using a questionnaire, and the country basically would adopt this questionnaire, which is the key instrument for APRM. And the country will run this questionnaire through a set of stakeholders that are representing all the trenches of society, and that's where women actually get to also make their voice heard. The next step, once this country self-assessment report is consolidated with all the findings that resulted from the consultations using the questionnaire, the APRM undertakes a review mission. So as at the Continental Secretariat, we are now deployed into countries. We also call upon other experts, other institutions, civil society organizations, other African Union institutions also to come on board, because we try to rely on the expertise of the different bodies. And to tackle those issues, democratic issues, economic issues, obviously economic governance issues, corporate governance issues, socioeconomic development, and state resilience issues. So once we undertake this field mission, or which we refer as the review mission, the outcome of it is a report, and this report has a national plan of action. A national plan of action which basically lay out the recommendations and the plan on how to implement those recommendations into the country with regards to the issues that were raised or the findings that were raised through the process. So after this report is validated by different stakeholders at continental level, but also national level. So the country will convene the different stakeholders, civil society organizations, women, youth, media, all the different groups to come and review the report, validate it, and then this report is submitted to the head of state, which will now present it to his peers at the AU Assembly, the African Union Assembly, which takes place every year between January and February. At that level, it means that the head of states and the country has endorsed the report. It means that AU policy bodies have endorsed the report, and the report will now be launched into the country by the country. Which will now serve as a ground to start implementing the recommendations. Those recommendations are integrated into existing national development plan for countries that do have national development plan. So I'm going into the details a little bit, but yeah, just to give you an idea of what APRM actually does, and what our responsibility, myself as a country coordinator, basically is to oversee this process into the countries which I've been allocated to. There's quite a few of us. I'm responsible for a few countries in Central Africa, like Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and so on and so forth. So, yeah. Well, what I need to mention though is that one of the key really that we try to bring in, the key aspect that we try to maintain and bring into the APRM process where it's lacking, is that we try to ensure as much as possible broad-based stakeholder participation, and especially women and youth. So as much as we have a youth desk at APRM, we also have like a gender program that ensures the mainstreaming of gender into governance processes and governance related issues on the continent. So yeah, so that's more or less it. I think that gives you a picture of what APRM does. Thank
It
you.
definitely gives a very expansive picture. And I'm just thinking here, if our podcast topic was just us discussing APRM, I'd have even crazier questions in terms of how does the integration look like in NDPs? I mean, I'm thinking of South Africa's NDP for 2030. And the last time it was edited, which sometimes you're a little bit embarrassed to even think about, and kind of like the role APRM plays in holding states accountable to value those recommendations, because they're not being gathered out of thin air. I think the methodology you guys use is a methodology that is true and sticks. And it would be very interesting to explore kind of like the role that the government or even necessarily a ruling party plays in either just seeing those recommendations as decoration or actually taking them like seriously. But really neither here nor there. Maybe in another podcast we can discuss exactly just that. But I want us to zone in on this importance of good governance, right? From what I'm hearing, it's kind of like at the core of APRM, all the different five methodologies that you guys use and the strategies that you have in order to be able to gather data. At the end of it, right, it's the promotion of good governance, but good governance often is paired with democracy. And so just to make it relatable to women, I just wanted you to maybe draw a picture for us of the relationship between good governance and democracy and women's rights.
Thank you. Yes, like I was saying, at the heart of APRM is good governance, and in terms of like giving you a clearer picture of the relationship between governance, democracy, and women's rights, is that first of all, democracy is a pillar for good governance, which APRM promotes, as I mentioned. So when you look at the core of democracy is the respect of human rights as well. And when we speak of human rights, we also speak of women's rights. So basically, that's where the thread comes from, is that you cannot have good governance without having democracy, which stands for human rights and women's rights. So by acceding to the APRM, African member states, African Union member states agreed to independently review the compliance of the African and international governance commitments. When I talk about commitments, we're actually talking about legal instruments and standard and codes. So that's where like the Declaration of Human Rights comes in. That's where the Charter of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women comes in, also CEDAW, and that's where also the Maputo Protocol comes in. So you'll see that when you talk about good governance, it means that we must review and promote instruments or come up with instruments. So basically look at policy formulation and all these things in line with the text that promote democracy. We also have ACDEC, and in line with the text that promotes women's rights, like I mentioned, the Maputo Protocol and CEDAW, which has been ratified by most of African countries. I think in the Maputo Protocol as well. In Africa, there's only 2 countries which have not ratified it as yet. Actually, I think it's just one. I just have to double check again.
Yeah, I
Because
believe
Sudan,
it's one now. Yeah,
yes, because
I
Sudan, yes.
mm.
Yeah. So so basically, noting, for instance, now CEDAW, the protocol, which are the 2 main instruments promoting women's rights. Those instruments are integrated within the governance processes which APRM is promoting. And as I mentioned earlier on, one of the pillar of governance is democratic and political governance. So yeah, so that's where the thread is really. To have good governance, you have to be able to assess a country on its democratic on the democratic pillar. And when assessing the democratic pillar, you have to break it down and look at the elements that touch on human rights and women's rights. And I'll add to that actually APRM instruments, the questionnaire which I mentioned earlier, actually has talks to all those different pillars, so democratic pillar, the economic governance pillar, and all those governance pillars. And when we look at, and I'm happy to share with you the questionnaire. When you look at the questionnaire and you look at the democratic and political governance section, and you look at the indicators that have been developed there, they are they speak directly to human rights and women's rights, actually, and we touch on women's political participation, and all those issues that really pertains to women, even in terms of peace and security issues, looking at the nexus between peace, security, and women, also the role of women in peace processes, and conflict prevention and conflict resolutions. So really, you will see that women is really at the one of the standing leg of democracy, and in the bigger picture, governance. Yeah. So it's really hard to disassociate these 3 elements. I think to me they are definitely interdependent, and I hope that in my explanation I have I have illustrated it quite accurately for you.
No, definitely.
Thank
And I
you.
agree with your explanation of it, right? So the relationship between democracy and human rights is symbiotic, and even more so within human rights of those who don't have the full fruition of their rights in the first place, especially women in context of conflict. I mean, they're the most affected by conflict, whether it's in terms of sexual impact that the conflict has got, or even the fact that they become now the breadwinners at home, when the men have kind of like been drafted to go and serve the country, and the implications of that. And I think now maybe just to get into the practicalities of it, right? I think the big question I have, and it's something that's very unique on the African continent, we have women leaders, right, in positions of power. MPs who are sitting in parliament. And I mean, I'm thinking of the case of Rwanda now, having the biggest parliament with women representation in it. And even here in South Africa, we have a pretty fair representation of women in these legislative powers and seats. But I was curious now if there's a relationship between that representation, that formal representation, and the actual participation of women in democracy who are not in those positions of power. So maybe to break it down even more, just because there's a woman in power, does that mean that the women who don't have that power feel represented by that woman? And just to get like your thoughts on that, particularly on like a parliamentary level.
No, that's a very good one, because we've been debating it through our engagement also on when we go to field missions. It's something that, always comes under our pen, especially because we see it, that women's rights has kind of evolved. Women's participation has kind of increased, to some extent in certain countries over time, especially if you look at, since the 90s to today. We can definitely say that, there's been some kind of improvement. I mean, today women in Africa, in all countries, have the right to vote. In terms of leadership, in 2020, Africa is second actually to Europe in terms of female heads of parliaments. From the last time I checked, I think 16 versus 17 female heads. We have female heads in parliaments in Africa and 17 in Europe. As compared to Asia, I think there's 8 women speakers, and in Middle East and in America, very surprisingly, from last time I checked, which was maybe like a year ago, I'm saying that we just have to double check the the stats, as we stand today. But in America, we were talking about America and Middle East used to be one last time I checked. So, and like you mentioned, in Rwanda, we have about 61% women in parliament. South Africa actually is second second on the continent. I think there's about 46 women. And Senegal, and South Africa is followed by Senegal and Namibia. Excuse me, we'll just have to pause this. Someone is knocking on my door. All right, we can carry on. Cool. So in terms of, yes, I was explaining that South Africa follows Rwanda with 46%. Senegal is also just about the same as South Africa. I think this is sitting on like 42. Once again, we just have to double check. And then it's followed by Namibia, who's fourth. But then to come back to your question is that the relationship between, these numbers that we see in terms of, like women representation in parliament and the actual impact. It's an issue where we actually, in terms of impact, I will definitely say that there's been some increase that has resulted in terms of promoting gender equality, especially from a women's rights perspective. Countries that have been ratifying or domesticating instruments or laws promoting women's rights and political participation, like in Niger, the women in parliament, we were in Niger in 2021, and on the ground we have taken note of the increase in terms of representation in Niger. As an example, from 12% to 26% over a period of more or less 10 years. And the result on the ground, obviously we have to take into account the context and the context of the country. We have to take into account, other elements that might have contributed to such results. But then we have noted that some laws promoting women and gender equality have actually been implemented, as a result, whether directly or indirectly, to this increase of representation in parliament. But I will say once again, I think the best practice that we keep quoting all the time is Rwanda. Rwanda is a great example of how numbers can impact society. Rwanda, since 1994, has emerged as a fast-growing economy, as we all know, and it is part of the world's 10 fastest-growing economies with an estimated growth rate of about 7.9%. And like I mentioned earlier, in Rwanda, it's the highest, knows the highest number of women representation in parliament. I mean, 61%. Um, so I think to some extent, we can definitely note that there is a relation between number and impact. However, I would like to say that the context of a country also plays a very big role. When I say context, is because um, in um, in Sudan, for instance, they've been going through, the transition, and right now they're having conflicts and so on. So as much as, there's been some progress in in the legal framework promoting women in Sudan, um, you can see that actually the parliament has been suspended since 2019. So for me, it's always about, as much as in Rwanda, we have cases where we can actually, highlight, the progress that Rwanda has made, and that we can link it back to the fact that, there's more women involved in politics, represented in parliament. Also, in other situations, this relationship can be a bit more difficult to trace, or might not actually be related. Sometimes, actually, we'll see that the civil society on the ground is the one that's actually driving the change in the country. And I would like to say once again, for instance, that's the case with Sudan. And once again, when I talk about Sudan, yet again, women are, really at the forefront of these changes happening. So yeah, that's what I would say from my perspective with regards to this question on the relationship, is that there is an existing relationship. We can prove it in some instances. In other instances, we should also take into account, other factors, and other players like civil societies, because they actually do also play a role, and they may actually drive more impact towards, women's rights, and even promoting women into leadership position, So yeah, thank you.
Well, I think your last point there with the role of civil society and the role civil society plays in not only promoting human rights, but just the protection of those who are minorities in society, links very well with the next question I actually want to ask you, and our last question for our conversation. Maybe you've touched on it already a little bit, but maybe we can expand on it a bit more. What role do you think civic organizations like DDP and accountability organizations like APRM play when it comes to promoting women's representation and political participation in not only just South Africa, but like the whole continent?
Okay, I think something that DDP and APRM have in common is that ability to, build capacity for capacity building, which I think is like so crucial. And like, I don't think that we can emphasize enough on it. Why I'm saying that capacity building is important is because, first of all, from an APRM point of view, is that APRM promotes dialogue. APRM is a platform that builds a bridge amongst the different stakeholders. And when I say the different stakeholders, I'm talking about state actors and non-state actors. State actors, you have the governments, obviously. And then the non-state actors, that's where now you have your civil society organizations, you have the private sector, and all of that. So very often in the countries in Africa, and I'm sure it can pretty be similar in other parts of the world, is that there is a communication gap. You have the civil societies, you have the ordinary citizen on one side raising issues, but there's no means of escalating it to, government issues. They do not have access to the parliament that would be now able to put together the right policies, to address certain issues. And I think that the work that APRM does will now to bring those different actors and say to them like, hey, listen, you need to speak to each other. And this is how we'll even provide you a way of going about it. Yes, is the methodology, which which I had touched on earlier on. And it also involves capacity building, because when the country puts together those national structures, I just have to go a little bit deep into it, because I mentioned the focal points earlier on. I mentioned the National Secretariat, but I did not mention the National Governing Council, which is paramount in the APRM process, because the National Governing Council represents civil society organizations. The National Governing Council is basically the representative of all the different layers of society, the private sector, the media, all of those components are represented within this National Governing Council, obviously by a few members, but then they stand as ambassadors. And this National Governing Council is the one driving this APRM governance process in the country. When they are set up, the structures are set up, the APRM conducts capacity building workshops where we now prepare them to, undertake this exercise of review. And by preparing them, that's when we say that, you as civil society, what are your issues? Here is a tool. This is how you can use it. But then we also invite, state actors to the table. So having all of them in one room actually facilitate this dialogue, but then also put them on the same level of understanding and bring in that inclusiveness element to it. So for us also, it's more about, teaching, not teaching because we're not teachers, but, trying to, share experiences and best practices in terms of governance, looking at those different issues. When it comes to democratic and political governance, let not the government alone come up with solutions. Let it be an inclusive process. So that's when they all in that room, when we talk about capacity building, we also talk about, okay, how do you say that you have issues of gender-based violence, okay? How do you develop a law, that will speak to gender-based violence, but you don't bring the other actors to the table? So the women are not present, the children are the children, like youth associations are not present. The school bodies are not present. So it's more about, like sensitizing the government and say that, okay, you cannot do this process alone. You have to be accountable. And also it's about also giving responsibilities to the citizen, so that the citizen knows what the government has committed to, and the government knows that it can rely on the citizens to, follow the law, be accountable, be basically serve as as citizens. We are basically the ones that live through the decisions that are made. Hello, that are made through through the government bodies and so on and so forth, like the parliament and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, we are the beneficiary of that. So there's this interrelation, this interconnection that is created when we conduct those kind of workshop. And we try to maintain these touch points across the process through these NGC bodies, which we have institutionalized in countries. I mean, not we, but in countries have institutionalized in their respective countries. So I understand that when I think of DDP, I can definitely see how DDP can, also play a role. Let's say, from my perspective, from an APRM perspective, it would be now to have, DDP talking about or sensitizing parliamentarians, sensitizing, other government bodies, about the work that APRM is doing, and also seeing how, women can be more included into the process. Because I can tell you one thing is that one thing that APRM struggle with is that the fact that there's no, we know that sometimes in countries when we go to, there is a lack of knowledge about what the APRM is within the government. Some few actors in the government might know about the APRM, about how to promote governance. APRM is about governance and the national plan of action which we put in place, but then the parliament is not aware of it. So women in parliament don't even know that have a tool that has led to a report, a very comprehensive report about issues which concerns them, And so I think in terms of bridging this gap, that's where, it's like civil institutions can come in and say, like, listen, our country has committed to the APRM process, which is a governance process, to promote good governance. From that, we have developed a report as a nation. And we have come up with recommendations, and there is a national plan of action, which says that, this is how we're going to implement, we're going to have a law on gender-based violence, and this is the time frame for it, and for implementation, this is the time frame. So really, it's a very comprehensive plan that is the outcome, or that is the outcome of this review report. And I can tell you, South Africa has done two of them already. So South Africa has already done 2 country reviews, and the last one was done in 2021, is about to be launched normally this year. And this country review report includes a national plan of action. We call them NPOA. And to link back to the national development plan, which you were mentioning. So so what some countries do is that they use the national plan of action as the new national development plan of action. However, if there's already a national development plan in place and it coincides with the implementation period of the national plan of action, then we integrate the two. So it will just be a matter now of, looking at the areas that needs to be improved, or like the way to synergize, refine the action plan. I mean, the action points, or the strategies that have to, follow those actions, and so on and so forth. So we have a whole department that takes care of that and assist the countries to, either come up with come up with a national plan of action, and that also helps, integrate the national development plan with the national plan of action. And I think that's where the civil society organizations and institutions like DDP and can support APRM actually in terms of, ensuring following up with the implementation of those recommendations within the national plan of action. So yeah, that's more or less it.
Awesome. Diana Demba, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I think it's pretty obvious, like there's so many facets to the work that APRM is doing, but also I think it's really great that it always grounds itself to civil work, right? Because I think people would assume that, oh, okay, you're doing this reviewing thing, so it must be the state only that needs to be assessed in terms of how things are looking politically. I really like that category of state resilience that you had mentioned, because the implications of how resilient a state is or not resilient a state is so multifaceted. It can impact market, it can impact civil society, it can impact even the family circle, if we're really going into like the political terms of how everything functions. And I commend the work that you guys do. And from DDP, we're grateful to have the partnership with you guys and to continue having the 2 organizations work towards this common goal, this overarching goal of promoting good governance and democracy across the African continent. But with that being said, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really do appreciate it. To our viewers on YouTube and to our listeners on Spotify, thank you for sticking through. I know this episode is not our typical 20-minute one, but I think the conversation was so rich that it made it worth it. So well done for making it to this part of the episode if you are there. I look forward to releasing the next podcast. Stay tuned as we will be discussing all things youth related and continuing this discussion on women's rights, as Women's Month is coming up very soon. But with that being said, Diana, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me once again. Take care. Thank you.
Well, we really hope you enjoyed this episode. Check out our social media pages at DDP_democracy to engage with more of our content, or you can head on over to our website at ddp.org.za to keep up with any events that we might have planned for you. Thank you once again for joining us.